Years ago, arguing about trans people became the hottest topic online. These days, it feels like everybody is burned out and just tries to avoid the topic, or at least avoid getting into it like they used to. That's unfortunate in a sense, because the opposition to trans people has not gone away. Those people are still here, they're still working on legislation, they're still trying to come up with ways to get rid of us, but the defense of trans people has become a lot quieter than it used to be. We've all kind of just moved on from the debate. I think a decade ago, the ideas were still more up in the air. Not everybody agreed on everything, some of the talk was a little new, there were still experiments in what exactly we believed and why, and how we framed things. By this point, the dust has settled a little more, but I feel like even more progressive-leaning people walked away with some wrong impressions. We didn't come to very clear conclusions before people moved on. I still see people online and on TV and everywhere else get fairly basic information wrong about these topics, and the discourse is still, after all this time, rather confused. People are a little unsure about what they're saying. For that reason, I'm going to be exploring the topics of sex, gender, and transsexuals, and a few other related notes, but those are the three main pillars of this presentation. I don't usually comment much about my own identity, but it's worth clarifying here to set the tone, and I guess helps people understand where I'm coming from. Because people can get understandably defensive when it comes to this topic, nervous about conceding points to people whom they don't believe are coming at it from the right place, or for the right reasons. I'm a transsexual woman, and I'm broadly progressive when it comes to trans questions, which I guess, duh. I'm interested in exploring disagreements, but I don't want to throw any other trans people under the bus in order to gain acceptance from people who are typically anti-trans, but who might buy that I'm one of the good ones. When people tell me, as they sometimes do, that I am one of the good ones, I like to reply, yeah, I'm one of many good ones. In fact, you might find that most of us are the good ones. I'm going to be making some claims about biology because it does come up in this topic. I don't have a formal background in biology, or in medicine, or in any related field. However, I'm capable of looking up and reading academic sources, and of talking to people who do have the relevant education, and I know some of those people and I run by everything I say through them so they can tell me if I'm saying anything wrong. But I don't want to give an inflated impression of who I am, which is not somebody with any kind of authoritative credentials. Sex is a model that we made up to classify organisms that we encounter by the role they play in reproduction. So the question is, how do they pass on genetic material to their offspring? If they produce cells that we call gametes, which fuse together to create a new organism, we call this sexual reproduction. Nearly all organisms can be interpreted as one of four categories: male or female, the two complementary roles in most sexual reproduction; hermaphrodite, meaning an organism that fulfills both the male and female functions, either simultaneously or at different points in their life, which means there are different subtypes of hermaphrodite; or they're asexual, meaning this organism is from a species that doesn't reproduce through the fusion of gametes, and therefore doesn't engage in sexual reproduction. With this framing in mind, nearly all species can be interpreted as one of three categories. There's asexual species, which don't reproduce through gamete fusion. Some species are dioecious, meaning they have some kind of male-female distinction. This includes us and also most animals that you can think of. And some species are monoecious, or hermaphroditic, meaning they do reproduce through the fusion of gametes, but they don't have a strict male-female organism distinction. In other words, being a hermaphrodite is the norm for these species. Notice that I said in nearly all species. That's because these categories don't encompass 100% of organisms. In some species, sexual reproduction is more complicated, and as a result you would need more than two categories in order to model the roles of its member organisms. This is very rare and limited to things like algae, fungi, some microscopic organisms called ciliates. In some cases there are multiple different types of a thing, and any pair can come together to reproduce so long as they're not the same type. And then in some cases, reproduction may require a group of different things coming together like the pieces of Exodia. Though fascinating, keep in mind this is a very tiny category of strange exceptions, and that no birds, mammals, or any other higher life works anything like this. Now, if you're a human like I am, then your body probably has a type of cell called a gamete. Either a small gamete, in the case of humans this is called sperm, which your body produces regularly, or a large gamete, which we call an egg, or an ovum, plural ova, which your body has a finite store of and is slowly releasing throughout your life until depleted. Through sexual intercourse, the sperm of one person enters into the ovum of another, fusing together to create a zygote, the beginning of a new human life. If you're a sperm-producing human, we categorize you as male because the way that you would pass on your genetic material to an offspring is through the production of small gametes. Whereas if you're an egg-bearing human, we categorize you as female because the way that you would pass on genetic material to offspring is by providing the large gamete. And this distinction is what your sex designation boils down to. I sometimes hear people say that sex is a spectrum, or make the related claim that sex is bimodal, which is kind of a type of spectrum. It just means a spectrum where the distribution looks like this, with two lumps. This is erroneous. This is not what any real scientific sources claim. It likely stems from a mistake about what sex refers to, because there are various traits that correlate with sex, such as hormone levels, body hair, height, or bone structure, where if you were to take a measurement from every single person in society, you would end up with a spectrum, and some of those things might have a bimodal distribution. But sex itself is not like this, and none of these things are sex. These are just things that correlate with sex, which we call sex characteristics. For pretty much all intents and purposes, sex in humans is a binary classification, as it's intended to be. We consider all humans to be one or the other. And even when we're discussing other species that could have more than two sex designations, it's never a continuum or gradient or spectrum. If you're trying to describe something that requires a spectrum, like the social behavior of an organism, then sex is just not the tool you're looking for. While I'm here, I'll note that this is not my opinion about what sex should mean or ought to mean. I don't really care how words are used in the grand scheme of things. I'm a very descriptivist, so to say, when it comes to language. I'm just telling you this is in fact how the word is used conventionally. I've put together many different sources about how sex is used in academia, and what I found is not a divide or a debate, but an obvious, overwhelming consensus. You can look it up in any dictionary, any encyclopedia, we can open random biology textbooks, they all basically say the same thing. Sex, either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive function. There is an agreement by convention, individuals producing the smaller of the two gamete types, sperm or pollen, are males, and those producing larger gametes, eggs or ovules, are females. An individual organism's biological sex relies on the definition of sex organs and the types of gametes they produce, either eggs or sperm. Sex is a biological construct used as a binary descriptor. This is basically what you find everywhere you look. Now, if your opinion is that the word or concept should be redefined or should be kind of taken to mean something else, if you think that our understanding of it should evolve or shift, well, that's not an invalid opinion for you to have, and you could make your case for why you think that's a good idea. But that kind of change has yet to happen, so currently what sex means in practice is still what I've described. Now, what about a sterile person? Though it seems basically true, what I've said so far about sex is not totally comprehensive. It's more of a starting point that we can do some work on in order to create something that's fully comprehensive. A lot of definitions are like this if you really get into it. In this case, if I define a male and female simply as sperm-producing and egg-bearing, then what about a sterile male who doesn't produce sperm? We could also ask about a child who hasn't sexually matured yet, or a 90-year-old person who doesn't have any sexual function anymore, or a woman who's had a hysterectomy. The point is, what about a person who lacks their primary sexual function? A definition tells us what a word means, but what does it mean for a word to mean something? I know that sounds funny, but it is an important thing to understand. When we say that a word means so-and-so, what we're doing is we're describing what real people intend when they say the word. And that's all a definition ultimately is in its essence, a description of intention. A good definition provides the functional bounds of the intended referent of the word that it defines, and this is sometimes a work in progress. Some definitions are more strict or specific than others. If I were making the world's first dictionary and I had to define the word vehicle, I might say that it's a thing used to get around, like a bus or a car. Because I know that when people make that noise out of their mouth, vehicle, that's what they have in mind. That's what they're trying to talk about. But what about other things? I mean, is a bicycle a vehicle? Is a train a vehicle? Is a horse? You can't figure out what these words mean just by asking yourself rationally, or like doing some kind of equation, or doing an experiment in a laboratory. The answer to the question is, when real people use the word vehicle, do they intend for that to include trains? Do they intend for that to include horses? Do they intend for that to include bicycles? Do real people consider these things vehicles? If they do, then they are, and they're included in the definition, and if they're not, then they aren't, and they should be excluded from the definition. And you could rewrite this definition to be a little more specific in order to reflect that change in boundary. Instead of saying it's a thing used to get around, you might say it's a thing that uses fuel and machinery and stuff to get around. Or maybe it's something that requires an active driver, like maybe a train isn't really a vehicle, but a car is, because I have to drive a car, whereas I'm just a passenger on a train. I mean, I actually don't even know if people consider trains to be vehicles. I asked a bunch of people I knew, and some said yes, some said no, and half of them paused for a second and then said they didn't know, so I guess I don't know either. Even a word like vehicle, which feels like a simple concept and which we use all the time without having to stop and think about how we would interpret the gray area, can unfold into something more complex if you try to comprehensively define the boundaries of what does and does not qualify, instead of just giving a general account and leaving the reader to interpret what does and does not fit the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law, so to say. But notice that throughout this process, what I'm doing at every step of the way is asking not what should be a vehicle, but what people actually do consider vehicles. That is the job of a lexicographer. Definitions are not prescribed, they are observed. A dictionary is our attempt at capturing and archiving the ever-changing reality of what real people mean when they say words. Now, let's imagine that I have a large collection of vehicles. I want to store all of them in one of two different warehouses. I label one warehouse car storage, and I label the other boat storage. I also provide a working definition for both terms. A car is a thing that drives on land, and a boat is a thing that floats at sea. But then what if I found a broken boat, a boat that has a big hole in it? It can't float at sea, so what is it? Are we just going to be confused about how to interpret this object and not be sure which of the two warehouses to put it in? If it's not a boat, does that suggest that it might be a car? Well, no, it's obviously just a broken boat. It could have floated at sea before something went wrong that prevented it from doing that function, and my first attempt at a definition didn't take exceptions like this into account. It's like if a dictionary had defined swans as white birds before discovering that black swans are a thing. Well, okay, you just have to go back and take the word white out of your definition. That's what happens when we stumble upon an exception that our previous definition didn't properly account for, if our goal is to update the definition to be even more specific and precise, which we don't always bother doing, but let's suppose we are doing it in this case. Our goal is to integrate the exception into our model. For the most part, I can say that boats are things we use to float on water, and it's not really going to cause any confusion because people can do the one-step extrapolation on their own about how they should interpret a boat that has a big hole in it and therefore can't float anymore. But if I wanted to be extra precise, I could write into my definition that a boat is a vehicle whose intention, design, or emergent purpose was or is to be propelled across the surface of water or other water-like liquids, and which is capable of serving as a means of travel for some kind of entity, typically a human, without being submerged in said liquid under normal operating conditions, and which has some kind of mechanism for propulsion other than being pulled along by the motion of the water itself, such as but not limited to oar, engine, or sail. And even this definition probably isn't perfect, maybe you could find something that doesn't quite fit, but it's a lot more comprehensive than a thing we use to float at sea. If at first I say that a male is a sperm-producing organism and a female is an ova-bearing organism, most people don't even bother thinking about the exceptions where a person in actuality fulfills neither function because they understand that an infertile or an immature male would still just be interpreted as male because although they don't have the functionality in the moment, they have all the features that are going to lead them to sperm production later, or they used to produce sperm but they do no longer. If you really wanted to rules lawyer me on this, I would have to change it to, a male is a human whose biological features or morphology is of the sperm-producing variety, while a female is the same thing but of the ova-bearing variety, and they're both identified by the presence or absence of sexual development of gonads toward either ovaries or testes. When a human is in utero, meaning in the uterus of the mother before they're born, they have a gland called gonads, which develop into either testicles, which make sperm, or ovaries, which come with a set of undeveloped dormant ova in the body that are gradually depleted through the ovary's regular process of selection, maturation, and release, which for simplicity's sake is called oviproduction, although the female body doesn't actually produce new ova in the same way that the male body produces new sperm. The question ultimately remains, if this organism were to pass on its genes, would it do so as a male or as a female? Would it do so by providing the male genetic material or the female genetic material? And if anything gets in the way of its development to prevent it from reproducing, then the question shifts to, okay, well what if that hadn't happened? Then would it have engaged in reproduction by providing male genetic material or female genetic material? And whatever the answer is, that's how we interpret it. What determines whether your gonads develop into one or the other? This is where most people start talking about chromosomes, which do matter, but the talk around them can be misleading. Your sex is not your chromosomes. Your sex is not defined as, nor does it boil down to, what chromosomes you have. Instead, your chromosomes, or really just one specific chromosome, is the thing that typically causes you to become one sex or the other. But there's a big difference between a causal relationship, where one thing tends to lead to the other, or give rise to the other, and an identity relationship where we say that one thing is the other, or is defined as the other, or is just an alias for some other thing. In this case, they are related, but they're still two separate things. The biology is that a chromosome is a thread-like structure made up of DNA and proteins. These come in pairs for some reason, typically 23 pairs, or 46 individual strands per cell nucleus. Why 23? Well, that's kinda like asking why we have 10 fingers, or why you have 26 bones in your foot. It's just a number. So there's 23 pairs, and one specific pair, usually shown as the very last, is called your sex chromosomes. The reason we call them your sex chromosomes is because under normal circumstances, they seem to be what cause, trigger, or induce sexualization. In this context, sexualization doesn't mean making a character look sexier, it means an organism developing in such a way that it can be distinguished as one sex or the other. So in utero, you sexualize into a male or you sexualize into a female. The first chromosome in your sex chromosome pair is always what we call an X, while the other is either also an X, in which case the embryo probably developed into a female, or it's a Y chromosome, which under normal circumstances has a special protein called the SRY gene, which literally just stands for sex-determining region Y, which probably causes the embryo to develop into a male. The reason I say probably is because this isn't always the case. It's only typically or normally the case, as in like greater than 99% of the time. But it isn't so by definition. By comparison, we don't need to say that a triangle probably has 3 sides or typically has 3 sides. It just has 3 sides, because if it doesn't, then it's not a triangle. Let's imagine a person who has a male reproductive system, who's born with a penis, their body makes sperm, they can impregnate females, but when we karyotype them, meaning we look at what their genes are, their sex chromosomes are an X pair. So is this person male or female? This question is actually not ambiguous. It has a clear, definitive answer. This person is a male. They're just a male who has a chromosomal abnormality. This is what I mean when I say that your sex isn't defined as, nor does it boil down to your chromosomes. Having female typical chromosomes doesn't make you a female. It doesn't override everything else about you. There is a condition that causes this exact configuration of features called De La Chapelle syndrome, or XX male syndrome, where a person who has female sex chromosomes develops as a male for some reason anyway, likely because they somehow got an SRY gene from somewhere other than a Y chromosome. The human body is so complex, and there are so many humans in the world, that strange variations and things that we don't expect are bound to happen in some number. And when they do, the final question of what sex we consider the person to be has never been your chromosomes. For comparison, let's imagine that we find out that there's some other trait, such as being left-handed, or being gay, or having blonde hair, were found to be caused by one simple gene. Let's say it's having blonde hair, and it's caused by the BH gene. I think it actually is caused by a simple gene, but I don't know, that's not the point. BH, blonde hair, I'm just making shit up. We assume that these things are connected because every single blonde person that we test has this gene, and none of the people who don't have blonde hair have it, so it seems like this gene is what activates the blonde hair trait. Well, okay, but what happens if tomorrow we find a person who has natural blonde hair, but then we karyotype them and they don't have this gene? We might have an explanation for why this person's hair is blonde, and we might not, but regardless, we wouldn't say that this person doesn't really have blonde hair just because they lack the thing that normally causes blonde hair. The definition of being blonde wouldn't be having this gene. The gene is just the thing that makes people blonde. We don't conflate the thing itself with the thing that causes the thing. But people sometimes make this mistake when it comes to chromosomes. Now what about intersex people? This term can be a little misleading because a lot of people think it sounds like something that's between the sexes, neither male nor female, which could suggest it's a third, distinct sex designation. There is a term in biology for an organism that performs both male and female functions. It's a hermaphrodite. Intersex people are not hermaphrodites, and there is no such thing as a human hermaphrodite. Although in the past there were people who were erroneously called hermaphrodites because they had a combination of male and female sex characteristics, but they were never hermaphrodites in the biological sense where they had both male and female reproductive function. In other words, there has yet to be a human who makes sperm and has ova, who can impregnate others or be impregnated themselves, and maybe one day our technology will allow us to effectively create a hermaphrodite, but so far, no. The meaning of the term intersex is a person who has atypical sex characteristics. An intersex person is still considered either male or female. They would just be an intersex male or an intersex female. For example, one of the most common intersex conditions is called Klinefelter syndrome. This appears to be caused by a chromosomal abnormality, where instead of having 2 sex chromosomes, a person ends up with 3, making them not XX or XY, but XXY. They still have an X chromosome, which still has an S or Y gene, so they end up developing as male, but then they experience various abnormalities, especially during puberty. These vary but can include female breast growth. A person who has Klinefelter syndrome is intersex and may experience certain female-typical sex characteristics, but ultimately they are still male organisms. If they were to reproduce, they would do so by passing on male genetic material. In some very rare cases, a person with an intersex condition ends up with an especially atypical combination of traits, which could lead us to ask whether we're justified in conceptualizing a third sex designation to catch these exceptions. Let's consider some of these examples. If a person has what's called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or CAIS, their body may begin a process of masculinization as their gonads differentiate into testes, but those testes don't descend and their body instead develops a vagina with a mostly female phenotype. However, this person may have XY chromosomes and lack a uterus. This person is technically a male, but this is one of the most atypical males you could imagine. If a person has something called XY gonadal dysgenesis, or Swyer syndrome, spelled funny but it rhymes with Bayer, their gonads, instead of developing into either testicles or ovaries, will fail to develop one way or the other. They'll probably develop female features, including a vagina, but they'll be infertile and they don't menstruate. I think we would interpret this kind of like an infertile male, but again, this is really far from what you would expect a male to be. The third and final example that I'll consider is that if a person has something called an ovotesticular disorder, or a similar condition called mixed gonadal dysgenesis, they may end up with a combination of testicular and ovarian tissue, and may also have ambiguous genitalia. There's never been a case of a person like this who is capable of both male and female reproductive function, but the classification of a person like this still feels a little strange due to their combination of features and the fact that people both with and without a Y chromosome can end up in this way. If I were to ask you whether they're a male or female, you might be tempted to say both, or maybe neither? In some cases, we might just end up with a person whom we're not sure how to categorize, and that doesn't necessarily break or cause us to abandon the existing model. But for the sake of discussion, you could indeed make an argument that we should have a third category for people like this. If we were all to agree to that, though, it's still worth understanding that for 99.999% of everybody else, sex would still be a simple binary. It would just be a pie chart that has one extremely small other sliver. And this still would not justify saying that sex is a spectrum or is bimodal, because it still wouldn't be. These would still be discrete categories. There would just be 3 instead of 2. Instead of being a binary, sex would be a trinary, I guess. A ternary. A trinity! Sex itself is not the most important quality. Often what matters when we look at and interact with another person is not sex, but the various things that correlate or arise downstream from sex. These things are called sex characteristics, a term for pretty much anything that differs between sexes. These can be broken down further into primary sex characteristics, which are things directly related to reproduction, like the penis or uterus, and secondary sex characteristics, which are not directly related to reproduction, for example, males having more prominent facial hair. This is also how we categorize things like the males of many bird species being more colorful than females, or male lions having more prominent manes, or a simple difference like female bears being significantly smaller than male bears. Some related terms are genotype and phenotype. Your genotype simply refers to your genes, while your phenotype is the observable characteristics resulting from those genes. When it comes to the conversations about sex, we're generally talking about phenotype, or rather, specific parts of your phenotype, your gonads and their function, which define what your sex is. However, the phenotype of a person also refers to many other features that are not a part of sex. So, for example, what your face looks like. I'm going to continue adding to this graphic as we move on. By the mid-1900s, beginning in the 60s but remaining on the fringes till gaining more steam in the 90s, writers in various fields converged in wanting to distinguish between the underlying biology of sex and its related characteristics on one hand, and the way these biological differences play out socially or in cultures on the other. We might say, for example, that in a given society, men are expected to pay the bill if they go to a restaurant with a woman, but is that a sexual difference? Is that part of their sex? Is there some kind of expected to pay the bill-ness in your sperm? Well, no, it's obviously something else. It's something that arises way downstream as a result of sexual differences, but we can't say this is itself part of sex. It's clearly something else. And this other resulting phenomenon didn't used to have a proper name, so they gave it one. And the name they chose was gender. It took some time for adoption, but this is now largely how the term gender is used today. Gender is far from the only instance where we draw a distinction between the underlying concrete or base reality and a more imaginary, conceptual, or abstract idea that our experience with the concrete gave rise to. Consider, for example, fathers and fatherhood, leaders and leadership, having a profession and professionalism. In each case, the concept wouldn't exist without the underlying reality to give rise to it, but once established, they can all be spoken of, thought of, and exist independently from their origin. A person can exhibit fatherhood without technically being a father. A person can act professionally outside the scope of their job. A person can exhibit leadership despite not actually being in charge of anything. And the same can be said for other abstractions. It doesn't take much for us to recognize patterns. We're very good at it. It's kind of the main thing that we do. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, and patterns that affect social organization can become self-reinforcing or compound upon themselves. They create feedback loops. For example, if almost all the students at a school who play basketball are female, and almost all the students who play baseball are male, that likely influences which sport a new student is going to be interested in, because for various reasons people prefer environments where they feel that they fit in, and people tend to try and meet social expectations that they perceive are being placed on them. So they're going to look at the baseball team, they're going to look at the basketball team, and then the girls are going to say to themselves, well, I guess at this school girls play basketball, and the boys are going to say, I guess at this school the boys play baseball. They both feel more welcome or more at home in the environment where people like them are already more common. Now think about how this all might apply to an ancient human tribe. Just the fact that women get pregnant and nothing else could result in men and women occupying different social roles. And once that norm is in place, people will start to select for it. The most socially successful men will be the people who the boys of the next generation look up to and try to emulate. The elders teach their young, the young try to emulate elders. So generally, once a division or paradigm gets going, it keeps going. Then you realize it's not even just pregnancy. That's one difference. Females are also smaller, shorter, weaker, more vulnerable. They have a different psychology, different personalities. They hit puberty earlier. There are differences all over in so many different ways. There is no way when half your society clearly fits into one pattern and the other half clearly fits into the other, that you're not going to carve out some ideas in your head about what males tend to be like and what females tend to be like, which is essentially all gender is. History of terms. The discourse about gender originally focused on social roles, or gender as a category of association. The idea that some things are for girls and other things are for boys. This led to derivative terms like gender identity, gender roles, gender presentation, and others, which can cause confusion because now two people can both say the word gender without any qualification, and they're unknowingly talking about different things, which I see happen a lot online. Language like this began appearing in the American psychiatric literature in the 1950s, albeit the meaning has since shifted. The term roles was used at the time to capture the whole social phenomenon, while the term identity, or core gender identity, was used for the persistent internal or private experience of that social phenomenon. They also talked about sexual identity, by which they meant your sexuality, which was just another piece of a person's broader social identity. meaning the way in which a person is self-aware of how they fit into their society. Today there's a multitude of terms like gender performance, expression, or presentation, which all describe the ways in which a person actualizes a certain gender role, which is any behavior, attitude, or appearance associated with a person depending on if they're perceived as a man or woman. We may then combine this with a description of sex and phenotype to create a rather thorough report of a person's place within a given social structure. A person could have a male genotype and a female phenotype, a male gender identity, but go to dinner with their grandparents where they adopt a more female gender expression. However, for the vast majority of people, this is all a bunch of unnecessary specificity because these things are going to align. Male genotype, male phenotype, male identity, male expression, or vice versa. When a person uses the term gender, it's their responsibility to ensure the context is understood via some type of qualification. If no qualification is given, then I guess they failed you, but at that point it's your responsibility as a listener to figure out what is actually being spoken of, and the truth of any given statement about gender can vary depending on what sense of the word is under examination. A good example of this is the statement, "Gender is a social construct." Is gender a social construct? This phrase has become less common over time, but back in, say, 2013, it was something that any person who used the internet regularly heard in some place or another. Gender is a social construct. What does it even mean and why does it matter? This claim gets a lot of mileage for something that I don't think most people could explain if you asked them to. Gender is a social construct became something that people just said out of habit, an utterance whose main purpose was not to convey any specific meaning to the listener other than to indicate which side of the issue you're on. It reminds me of the joke about how during any given meeting you can just, without even really listening or paying attention to the conversation, inject, "It's all about finding the right balance." And people will just nod in agreement as though you've said something meaningful, but you're kind of just saying something that could always be said, you know? And on the other side of things, people realized that progressives kept calling everything a social construct, and therefore they felt obliged to disagree before it was even really clear to them what they were disagreeing with. So a social construct is anything that is so only because we've all agreed that it is. It's kind of just a fancier way of saying a convention. A good example of a social construct is the meanings of words. The fact a rock is hard or sinks in water is not a social construct. It's a truth about the natural world we observe. But why does the word rock refer to this object, or to any given thing? There is no truth of the universe to that association. We just needed a noise and some symbols to refer to this thing, and rock is what we came up with and agreed to. It's only true that rock means a rock, because we all agree that that's what that sound means. It's only true by convention. We could go on to say that other aspects of language are socially constructed, from the words to the spelling and grammar. Actually, we could probably just say the whole language is socially constructed. English is a social construct. Another common example is law. What is it that makes a thing legal or illegal? There is no natural truth being observed. If every single human in the world decided that any given thing was illegal, then it would be. That's the magic of social constructs. The truth is whatever we, as a society, decide. We are the truth makers, at least when it comes to this type of thing. And you can repeat all of this about morality, or good manners, or conventions like how many yards are in a mile, or what year is it right now? It's 2025? I don't know, it's just because we say it is. When does the weekend start? I assume you get the idea. Is this the same as being subjective? It does sound similar, and the two often overlap, but no, these are different categories. A quality being subjective or objective is a question of whether it's a quality of the object, or if it's something that arises or takes form only in the perception of the subject or in relationship between the subject and object. Subject in this context means the outside entity that is observing or otherwise interacting with the object, which is the thing in examination. A common example of a subjective quality is beauty. What does it mean for something to be beautiful if not that there is some kind of observer who considers it beautiful? And if nobody considers a thing beautiful, then how can it be said to have beauty? What else would having beauty mean? Not all qualities are like this. If I tell you the brick is hard, I'm telling you about the brick. If I say the brick is beautiful, really I'm telling you more about me than the brick. I'm telling you my preferences or my perception or my taste or something. Speaking of which, a different example that may be more helpful for understanding the distinction is the taste of food. Why does honey taste good? I don't know. It just does. Now, another person might disagree with me and say that honey tastes bad. Whether honey tastes good is subjective because tasting good requires a taster to evaluate it as being good tasting. It's possible that a space alien species comes to Earth tomorrow, they try honey and strawberries, and to their tongue all of this stuff tastes disgusting, and from their perspective we're all crazy for enjoying it, and then maybe to them dog shit tastes amazing. But whether or not something tastes good to me is not socially constructed. I don't only think honey tastes good because my society has decided that it tastes good, or developed a convention and taught me that I'm supposed to like it. The reason I like it is just a matter of what I experience when I put it in my mouth. My enjoyment of it is independent from social influence or convention. I'm actually going to acknowledge that it is possible for some aesthetic preferences to be like this, not in whole but in part. For example, some people argue that how we feel about popular music is probably socially induced to a large degree, and that our idea of what music is good just comes from hearing it over and over and it being normalized to us, which is why our taste in music might be different depending on what society we grow up in or what time period we grow up in. There are some aspects of music theory that do seem to kinda just be natural and don't need to be taught or induced, so I don't know, it's probably some of both, and this could be an interesting discussion to be had all on its own, but even if you accepted all this, that just means there are two distinguishable variables, and that's clearly not what's happening when it comes to honey tasting good, so set all that aside. If I were to say that gender is socially constructed, what I would probably mean is that gender roles entail socially constructed associations. So, to wear a perfume that smells like flowers, is that masculine or feminine? Well, it depends on the society. Maybe it's a unisex thing that everybody does. Maybe only men do it. In my country it would be more of a feminine thing, but it's not inherently feminine. There are some qualities that people feel get closer to objective observation rather than frivolous cultural fodder like food or clothing, such as the association between men and being stronger and more physically aggressive. It isn't beyond imagination that a society could think women are more violent and men are more peaceful, but I don't think there's ever been a society like that because it goes pretty directly against the biological reality created by hormonal differences. So at this point, some people have an intuition, which is not quite right, but I understand where they're coming from, that some aspects of our gendered associations are not really social constructs, but instead some kind of underlying truth that we're tapping into. In that view, though, it would still have to be the case that we socially construct a bunch of things on top of that foundation, leading to at least some area of agreement where things like which colors are for girls and which colors are for boys is socially constructed, even if you think that boys being stronger isn't. Though, again, it is. This also indicates that such associations are clearly malleable, which is probably the only important thing that anybody is getting at by calling things a social construct. I'll come back to this. So far, I've only been using gender to mean gendered associations. What about gender identity? This one is more of a funny question, because what does it even mean for a personal identity to be socially constructed? I actually think that people are equivocating on the word constructed, and that what they mean is not something that is a construct, but something that is induced by social factors. In other words, this is really just another instance of a long-standing debate within some areas of biology or sociology that people call nature versus nurture. This is when we try to determine the extent to which a thing is caused by genes, or nature, and the extent to which it's caused by the conditioning that you experience growing up, interacting with other people, or with other aspects of your environment, the nurture. For example, let's say we notice that girls cry more than boys. Why is that? Is it nature or nurture? It could be something innate, like hormonal differences, but it could also be that we teach young boys while growing up that crying isn't okay, and that if they want to be proper men someday, they have to learn how to control their emotions. Whereas we don't do as much to discourage it in girls, thus we create a difference in behavior through nurture. Then again, it could easily be a combination of both, but if so, which factor accounts for how much of the difference? Is it about 50-50? Is it 20% nature, 80% nurture? This is really the area of disagreement for many observable differences between people. Almost everything about you is a combination of nature and nurture, people just disagree how much of one and how much of the other. There's really only a few things that result entirely from nature without any influence by nurture. One example is your blood type, which is unchanging after being genetically determined. And then some things do result entirely from nurture. For an example, what language do you speak? There is no natural language that comes built into your brain. It's just something you learn from people around you. And if you had been born in a different part of the world, you would have been taught a different language. So your biology really has nothing to do with it. But again, many things are influenced by both. So getting back to the question, is your personal core gender identity determined by nature or by nurture? The answer is that it could be influenced by socialization to some extent, but today we believe it's almost entirely a matter of nature. However, as recently as the 1970s, there were people who thought otherwise, who supposed that core gender identity was determined entirely or nearly entirely by nurture, or by rearing, to use the term they used at the time. In the 1960s, a researcher named John Money saw an opportunity to test and hopefully demonstrate this hypothesis when a baby was brought to him that had lost most of its penis in an accident. Money somehow convinced the parents to let him give this child cross-sex hormones and just raise him as a girl. And Money thought that if you raise a child as a girl, the child will just accept that role and go along with it, because in his view, core gender identity was determined by socialization, and with this child, he hoped to prove it. For some time, people thought he did. But later Money came to be seen as having lied about the results of the experiment by hiding details of what happened to this boy, yet referring to it like a success story and as proof of how malleable gender identity supposedly was. In actuality, it went very badly. Money was accused of grossly mistreating this child throughout his upbringing, and he eventually came to reject what he had been taught and went back to living as a boy by the time he was 14. The experience was traumatizing, not only because of the confusion, but for the strict treatment the boy endured. Apparently he had a twin brother whom Money also got to work with, and he not only saw and worked with both of these boys naked, but he instructed them to pretend to be acting out sexual acts with one another, supposedly to enforce to the main boy that he was supposed to be in the woman's role, which Money claimed was a part of how the child would learn his new identity. Later in his life, the boy went on to kill himself. John Money is also noted for having written that he didn't think pedophilia was necessarily harmful, writing in 1991, among other instances, that a 10-year-old boy could probably have a sexual relationship with a man in his 30s and that would not be pathological. This, in addition to the incredibly unethical experiment that he lied about, leaves John Money as a controversial figure to say the least, and he's now remembered almost exclusively for negative reasons. He passed away in 2006. I have no interest in trying to rescue Money's legacy or reputation, but just in the interest of accuracy, I'm going to clarify a few things. John Money was not a pedophile. There's simply no evidence that he was one. If he had been a pedophile, it sounds like he was probably in a position where he could have easily sexually abused the children he had access to, yet decades later he has never been accused of that. Money was a researcher who did aggressively unethical things in effort to prove himself right. Unfortunately, this is something that happens sometimes with scientists or other intellectuals, which is why they do need oversight and ethics rules. Decades ago, ethics rules were a lot looser, and especially when you were dealing with a vulnerable group of people whom society generally looked down on or neglected, you could get away with even more than usual. There's probably a lot of abuse hidden away in our study of gender and related topics. Although Money was influential in some ways, he isn't like the founder of gender or something like that, nor is he somebody to whom modern progressives owe their beliefs. John Money's beliefs were directly at odds with what many people hold to today, because if children simply accepted whatever gender identity was given to them by their upbringing, then how could trans people even exist? Wouldn't trans women all just accept being boys, and vice versa? The failure of John Money's experiment is, if anything, a confirmation of the modern position. Trans people can't just be conditioned or willed out of being trans, because their identity and experience is not a result of conditioning, it's something innate that can't easily be changed. Just like how the boy in John Money's experiment who wasn't trans couldn't just be conditioned out of being a boy. Despite this, some people to this day cite John Money's experiment as though his sins discredit modern beliefs about gender or trans people. I think this is the main reason that a lot of people ever even hear this man's name. Finally, even if John Money had in fact been the first person to propose every facet of modern beliefs about gender, and he got all of it correct, spot on, he predicted perfectly what we believe today, and then he ran around being the worst person imaginable, like he was a racist, pedophile, serial killer who tortured and then cannibalized people, that would all be irrelevant to the accuracy or inaccuracy of his findings. If Einstein were a bad person, would that make relativity any less true? The type of argument that people are making when they attack money in this way is called a genetic fallacy, or a fallacy of origins, where an idea is evaluated not by its actual merits, but by how we feel about where it came from. I asked this question earlier, we're going to loop back to it now. At best, the notion that gender is a social construct is offered in reply to somebody who's speaking of gendered associations as though they're timeless, or something that can or should never change. It can be useful to point out or remind people of the fact that humans are in control of these standards, not the other way around. and we know that our standards can change, and they have changed in the past. However, there are also many conversations in which it's not that relevant a thing to say, and people just blurt it out anyway. The message becomes a little unclear, unless the intention is, as it often seems, to say this thing is just a social construct, therefore it doesn't really matter, because who cares, it's just a social construct. It feels like your goal is to trivialize the thing that we're talking about. And if your goal is to trivialize what we're talking about, this isn't a good way to do it, because something being a social construct doesn't make it unimportant. I think a more focused response in the context in which this is often brought up would be to say that our standards are demonstrably malleable. A malleable thing is one that we can change or alter over time without breaking. We understand that laws are malleable, and that language is malleable. We understand that fashion changes, so do gendered associations. There's no reason to bring this language of social construction into the mix most of the time. It doesn't add anything to the discourse and is often just confusing. Okay, part 3. We're getting into the big topic. Transsexuals. The term transsexual first came to English in the 1940s, derived from the equivalent German Transsexualismus, as used in 1923 by the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. There's always been some disagreement about how precisely to define a transsexual person. A condensed way of trying to define it would be a person whose gender and sex are not aligned. So in other words, a person who's male but who identifies with and wants to live as a woman, or a person who's female but who identifies with and wants to live as a man. I personally believe there is some kind of underlying maleness or femaleness to our psychology or to our minds. Even before a trans person comes out and transitions and starts to look like the opposite sex, I think they have in their mind some kind of trans quality to who they are internally, and transitioning is just how they express or actualize that transness. But this part is conjecture. We don't really have a comprehensive understanding of the human mind or brain, so who knows? To account for the other parts of our language, the term transgender came about in the 1960s, intended to be an alternate term for the same phenomenon as transsexual. It was introduced by the psychiatrist J.F. Olivan, who said that transsexual was misleading because it made people think it was describing something sexual in nature, akin to homosexual. As I already went over, gender in its modern sense very first emerged in the mid-1900s, but became more popular in the 1970s, and then became very popular again in the 2010s. The term cisgender came about in the 1990s to describe the non-trans population, simply by taking the existing cis prefix, which is the opposite of trans in various contexts. Trans kind of meaning across or on the other side, and cis meaning on the same side as. Now, why are there two different terms, transsexual and transgender, that mean roughly the same thing? Today, some trans people reject the transsexual label, and some of them reject the transgender label. Many other people consider the two to be synonyms, or consider transsexual to be the outdated legacy term for what is now called transgender. Other people consider transsexual to be a subset of transgender, with different but overlapping meanings. I often shorten it simply to trans in order to deliberately sidestep this entire dispute, but it's interesting enough to review, and there is a deliberate meaning for why I used transsexual instead of transgender when I was titling the video. The term transsexual came first. Then, in the 1960s, people started saying transgender, which really caught on by the 80s. Christine Jorgensen, one of the most famous transsexuals, probably the first celebrity trans woman in the US, famously rejected the transsexual label, then in vogue, and insisted on being called transgender instead. She too cited her rationale as being that transsexual sounded like it meant something to do with her sexuality, so it does seem like that's what led the change most broadly. The term transsexual didn't fully disappear, however, it just became less common, and then later came back into popularity, like a fashion trend coming full circle. But the reason in both cases was more than a random trend. In the last couple decades, the meaning of transgender was deliberately expanded to include more than it originally did, becoming an umbrella term for a whole set of people that's mostly transsexuals, or at least that's what it seems, but then also other people who claim to be trans but not transsexuals. This left transsexual as the obvious choice to communicate that distinction for those who desire to do so. This is what I am signaling when I refer to myself as a transsexual. I'm using it as a more specific designation. And most of the time when I talk about trans people, really what I have in mind is transsexuals. People who actually transition and go from living as one gender to living as the other, which I think is what most people have in mind as well. The people who consider themselves transgender but not transsexual are generally speaking people who identify as the other gender but then just say that they don't need to transition for some reason. Or they might not identify as the other gender and just refer to themselves as being non-binary, agender, or something else. In using a more specific term to communicate which subgroup I'm a part of, my intention is only clarity and specificity, not to denounce anybody who's part of a different subgroup. Even though I don't directly relate because it's not my experience and it's not how I identify, it is important to me to protect the rights of gender-diverse expression. I would never want to live in a place where a bearded lady can't walk down the street feeling safe in public. Why are people trans? The short answer is nobody knows. It's just one of those many little quirks of nature, like how some people are gay, or some people are left-handed, or some people are sociopaths, some people are born with 9 fingers, some people actually enjoy cilantro. But we actually know what mechanism induces certain things, whereas with trans people we're still not sure. There are proposed hypotheses, but the exact truth of the matter is not settled. Maybe it has something to do with the hormones you're exposed to in utero? That's the area that a lot of people go into when they're trying to figure out a cause. Also, it's possible there are numerous different causes. For now, we kinda just accept that every new generation of people is gonna have some transsexuals mixed in there. It's been estimated to affect roughly 1 in every 200 to 300 people, or in other words, something like 0.3 to 0.5%. It could be more or less. I actually, and I don't have proof for this, but I kind of feel like these early estimates were a little high, and I would guess the actual figure is more like 0.1 to 0.2, but it's hard to know any of this for sure. A trans person is born into society with no knowledge that they're trans. They're raised in a gender-based social order where some people are boys and some people are girls, and people treat you differently depending on which one you are, and then for reasons that you don't fully understand yet, the adults start sorting you into different rooms. And then at some point along the way, often around the time they're beginning puberty, that person may become self-aware and realize, I'm a girl, but I really wish that I could be a boy, or I'm a boy, but I really wish that I could be a girl. And it's more than just a passing thought. It becomes a complex, a kind of obsession, something they can't easily get over or just stop thinking about, and it becomes this burning, curious desire. The question then shifts to how they want to navigate this situation. In a sense, the trans agenda is a proposal made by trans people to their community. They say, I am not a male, I'm a female, I was born and raised as a girl. However, my intention is to live as a man from now on. I would like it if you try to think of me like a male, treat me in the way that you would treat males, and I would appreciate if you refer to me using male-coded language like he and him, and then vice versa for people born male. Importantly, this doesn't require disputing any of the facts about biology presented earlier in this video. Trans people don't believe, and they're not asking you to believe, that their body is actually of the other sex. If that were the case, they wouldn't even be trans, they would just be cis people. Being female is embedded in the definition of being a trans man, because if they weren't female, they wouldn't be trans. The language that we use for a trans person actualizing their identity in the way that I'm describing is transitioning. Some people talk about social transitioning. This could mean changing the name that you go by or changing what kind of clothing you wear, and then medical transitioning, which means altering your body. Transsexual women are males who transition to live as women, while transsexual men are females who transition to live as men. It's become somewhat common to use man and woman for gender, but male and female for sex. This isn't always the case, and it hasn't always been the case, and it might not be the case in the future, but it's pretty common these days, and if we agree on a common distinction like this, it does prevent having to clarify each time in the future. Are trans people mentally ill? Well, if you're willing to respect the conclusion of modern psychiatrists, the simple answer is no, it's not considered a mental illness. By the way, a mental illness and a mental disorder are the same thing. It was sort of considered one in the past when trans people were less well understood. Trans people typically had a lot of distress and confusion, they had high rates of other disorders, their insistence on their own identity could be interpreted as some kind of irrational compulsion, so the medical professionals reviewing them would be like, well, something seems to be wrong with this person, and they tentatively threw us into the mental disorder of some kind bucket, where we stayed for a few decades until researchers decided to investigate the matter more. What is a mental disorder, or mental illness? It's something that causes significant impairment to your ability to live your life in a normal, healthy, functional way. It's possible for you to experience a certain symptom, but not so severely that it interferes with your ability to, let's say, have a job, maintain friends, go to school, interact with your family, have a relationship, stuff like that. You know, normal people stuff. If there can be people who lead normal, happy lives while being trans, then it just kind of follows from that being trans is not in itself a mental disorder. The belief that trans people are mentally ill, including what many people believe, which is that trans people are mentally ill by definition, like being trans is mental illness, comes mostly from misunderstandings about the term gender dysphoria, a term listed in the DSM-5 which people interpret as a renaming of an older term which was gender identity disorder. If you look up that name change, you may find sites claiming it was only renamed to help spare trans people's feelings because the term disorder was too stigmatizing. Which means that the reason wasn't that calling it a disorder had become technically inaccurate. The impression that people walk away with is that it really still is a disorder, we just kind of crossed that out for political reasons. So ultimately it's fair to say that trans people are still mentally ill, even though the DSM-5 doesn't officially call it that anymore. But this has various problems. The shift from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria was not really just a renaming, but also a reconceptualization of what it is we're even talking about, rendering the old one effectively obsolete. In the past, when people said that trans people are mentally ill, I think we were talking about the identity itself. In other words, when a trans woman insisted that she's a woman, or that she feels like a woman, or that she really wanted to be a woman, or whatever, that insistence was called a disorder. Whereas today we're more talking about the experience of distress or discomfort that arises from the divergence between a person's identity and the social expectations they experience in their society from the gender they're currently living out. So instead of the trans woman saying, "I feel like a woman," and that being a disorder, it's, "I feel like a woman, but then when I go to work and interact with my coworkers, or I go home and interact with my family, the social expectations on me are all male-oriented, and that causes me discomfort, and that part is really where the disorder is." Even then, being trans doesn't just mean having gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria, meaning, again, the distress or discomfort that arises from the incongruity between your identity and the expectations placed on you by society, is something that trans people often experience and which they are especially susceptible to, but not something that all trans people experience at all times, and which many trans people no longer actively experience after transitioning. This is why some people say that transitioning is the treatment for gender dysphoria. I think there's a colloquial mix-up between gender dysphoria as a general experience versus gender dysphoria as a real clinical diagnosis. And I think the latter is probably more uncommon than people realize. It's kind of like the difference between me saying that I feel anxious about something and having an anxiety disorder. Except in the case of an anxiety disorder, the word anxiety or anxious already existed, and then we named the disorder after that. Whereas with dysphoria, I think it happened the other way around, where people would start describing their experiences using the term dysphoria because they knew that that was the term used in the diagnosis. I'm not totally sure about that, but either way, many trans people describe feeling dysphoria or feeling dysphoric in cases where they're not really describing having those feelings in a way that is so significant it would be classified or diagnosed as a mental illness. They're basically just expressing that they feel sad or that something bothered them related to people treating them like their original gender, or related to their dissatisfaction with their ability to adapt to their new gender. Now, even if trans people were considered mentally ill by definition, as in even if being trans was the mental illness, this probably wouldn't accomplish what a lot of people who are interested in the distinction want. I feel like the purpose of claiming that trans people are mentally ill is to imply that we should doubt the validity of their identity. That when a trans person says, "I feel like a woman," we should just reply, "Shut up, no you're not, you're mentally ill." That could make sense if you consider how, in many other cases, people who experience mental illness are likely to exhibit what we call cognitive distortions, which can affect their judgment or reasoning. But that doesn't seem to be the case when it comes to trans people. People who identify as trans do go on to live as the opposite gender, and this makes them happy. There doesn't seem to be any mistake in their perception of the world or in their reasoning about how to navigate it. A similar claim that I sometimes see people make is that if a person is mentally ill and they claim something that isn't true, for example, if you're schizophrenic and you think the government is watching you while you sleep, then we shouldn't affirm that delusion. The problem here, aside from that I'm actually not even sure if we do never confirm the delusions of a crazy person. Maybe that is the right thing to do sometimes. But whatever, assuming it's just automatically true that you should never affirm a person's delusion, the problem is that unlike a person who's hallucinating or experiencing a delusion of causality, which is a common type of delusion where you think that unrelated events are actually connected, trans people do not perceive, believe, or claim anything about the world that is not simply factually true. In other words, there is no delusion. This itself is a little contentious and leads into the next point. Are trans people delusional? The people in society who dislike trans people and who don't want being trans to be socially accepted sometimes claim that trans people hold a false belief or deny some aspect of reality by stubbornly asserting, perceiving, or believing in something that is not true, despite the countervailing evidence. This is called a delusion, a fixed belief that is held without justification and despite the presence of evidence against it. However, if you ask these people to identify the belief that is supposedly false, they immediately run into some problems. The first answer that people sometimes give is that trans people believe they can change their sex. If that's what trans people believed, then trans people would be wrong, but it's not. Trans people don't think this. This is a misconception that could be blamed on the language of sex and its derivatives. The term transsexual could sound like it means somebody whose sex changes, and transsexual people get medical procedures that used to be called sex change operations, a term that is considered outdated and no longer used, in part because that's not what it does. But if we set aside some of these misnomers, trans people simply don't believe or assert that they're changing their sex, unless you're talking to a trans person who is a little confused about what sex refers to, but in that case whatever it is they are talking about is probably something they can in fact alter. All trans people know and understand that they're able to change some aspects of their body, but not all aspects. A trans woman is just a male who has feminized her body to some extent. They undergo feminizing hormone therapy, but they don't have wombs, they don't have ova, they're not able to get pregnant or have periods, they can't pass on their genetic material through large gametes that fuse with the sperm of some other person. And vice versa for trans men, they don't have all of the male features. There is no real confusion about any of this. Nobody misunderstands and thinks that we are changing more than we are in fact changing. The only confusion that sometimes arises is about what language is best to describe this reality. The second answer that people sometimes give is, trans women think they're women, or trans men think they're men. I don't even think this can be a delusion. Like, it doesn't make sense to call it one. I think if somebody implies that something like this is a delusion, what that indicates is they have failed to distinguish between a factual dispute and a linguistic one. The latter is not categorically able to be a delusion, or even a false belief. It's like asking what color is 5. It doesn't make any sense. Let's go over some examples to ensure we understand the distinction. If I tell you that this jar has 23 beans in it, and you disagree and say it actually only has 20, then we're having a factual dispute. There is an underlying fact of the matter, and we disagree about what that is. The reality may correspond with one of our claims, but not both, assuming our claims are contradictory. If I tell you we have an elevator in the lobby, but you're from Britain, so you call it a lift, then we're having a difference in language. We're talking about the same underlying thing, the same object, and we don't have any disagreement about the object itself, but we refer to the object using different names. Similarly, if I ask you for some chips, thinking of potato chips, but you're from Britain, so you come back with what I would call French fries, there is again a difference in language, but this time it's of a different nature. We're using the same name, but we had different objects in mind. And again, there is no disagreement in this case about the underlying reality. So it kind of happens both ways, where we look at the same object and we use different words, or we both use the same word but we mean two different objects. A word is just a noise, a series of symbols that directs us to some kind of meaning. It's like a signpost that points to a location. It's really the thing that we're pointing to that is important, not the signpost. There can be interesting discussion about linguistic differences, as in asking why one way of wording something might be clearer or better than another. But linguistic differences can't be a delusion, because they aren't even a matter of one's perception or understanding of reality. We can't possibly argue that an American is delusional because he calls a lift an elevator. It's just another name for the same thing. Disagreements about the word woman are a matter of people using the same word but intending two different meanings. Imagine if I tell you there's a crane in the park, but then you look in the park and there's no crane to be seen. That can obviously seem like we're having a disagreement about the fact of the matter. Is there a crane in the park or isn't there? Am I delusional? Am I seeing things? But really what's happening is that when I said crane, I was talking about a type of bird called a crane, whereas you were looking for a crane as in one of those industrial machines used to move heavy objects around by lifting it on a wire, you know? So we're not really having a factual dispute, because maybe there is a crane in the park, but there's not a crane as in the industrial machine in the park. But if we don't realize that we're encountering a linguistic conflict, I might be thinking to myself, what is wrong with you? Why do you not see that bird? And you might be thinking to yourself, what's wrong with you? Where is this machine? What are you talking about? I like to try and clarify things by writing out the different meanings as though they were separate entries in a dictionary. Crane, definition 1. A family of large, long-necked birds with sturdy bills and long, powerful legs. I don't know how exact this definition is, but that's from the Canadian Encyclopedia. Crane, definition 2. A machine that uses a hoist and pulley to lift objects, typically during construction, or to load and unload freight, like from a boat, I think it means. So this allows us to replay that interaction. I say, there's a Crane 1 in the park, but you look and you say, I don't see a Crane 2 in the park. So this time it's more clear that there is no actual conflict between our statements. We're literally just talking about different things. Like me saying there's a duck and then you saying there's not a bulldozer. Now let's imagine that woman is defined like this. We could have two different entries. Woman, an adult human female. Woman 2, an adult human who is typically female but could also be a trans woman who is not female. We'll expand on this a little bit more later. The point is there's a second meaning that is distinguishable from the first. An anti-trans person claims trans women are not women in the first sense. They're not women 1. But trans women don't claim to be women 1, they only claim to be women 2. As such, there is no factual disagreement between the two statements because trans women are not claiming to meet the criteria of the first entry. And as you can see here, the difference between these two entries basically just boils down to whether female is a required trait. So in some sense, the disagreement could be reframed as the question, do you need to be female to be a woman? And that kind of segues into the big question. Well, what's a woman? Oh yes, that is the question the arguments in the previous section are naturally leading to. The concept of a woman obviously came about to describe the general qualities of females, but now the proposal is that it doesn't need to be taken so strictly, and it's possible for a male to become part of what people intend when they say woman, provided that such males are sufficiently female-like in some way or another. Where exactly that line is drawn varies from person to person, so it's hard to nail down exactly what this means. But it's kind of like the other concepts that I mentioned as examples of a distinction between an underlying phenomenon and the abstraction that we create through our experiences of that phenomenon. If somebody can do fatherhood without being a biological progenitor, then why couldn't somebody be a woman without technically being a female, even though these two concepts are related in origin? And I mean, words are whatever we make of them, so I guess technically the answer to that question is there is no reason that this couldn't be the case. But on the other hand, why should it be? What is the point of adopting a less rigid, less exclusive definition for woman? This is actually an interesting part of the dialogue that a lot of people never reach because they get stuck on one of the points made before this and never progress. There's a natural shift in meaning sometimes that occurs when the intended referent of a word changes due to the original definition being pegged to something other than the qualities that are actually important, or the qualities that we actually care about and are trying to select for. This is especially likely to happen when there are changing circumstances in society, such as the invention of hormone treatment and gender-affirming surgeries, which make the existence of transsexual women more of a realistic phenomenon for the rest of society to grapple with and integrate into their understanding of the world. Let's think about a similar concept: fatherhood. To be a father in the rigid biological sense means to be the male progenitor of another organism. In humans, this means the person who passed on their sperm to create a baby. But from that meaning of father, we develop a concept of fatherhood, meaning the way that fathers do or should behave in society, or the type of relationship or commitment they do or should have to their offspring. It's then possible for a person to exhibit fatherhood toward a person without actually being their male biological progenitor. Now let's imagine I live in a society where people have only recently started adopting children as a new practice. And let's say I'm talking to a class of children, and I say, hey, if you don't know anything about hunting, then you should ask your fathers to teach you. But two of the children in the class raise their hand, and they say they don't have fathers. But I learn that one of them is being raised by a man who adopted them, and the other is being raised by their mother, along with another man whom their mother just married after their father died. Well, okay, I guess in this case, if they wanted to learn about hunting, they should just ask these men. So for their purposes, I could clarify that whenever I'm talking to the group and I use the word father, they can just assume that I mean those men instead, even though they're technically not the father, since for the purpose of what I'm talking about, it's not actually important for this person to be your biological progenitor. What mattered is just that it's a man who was committed to raising and taking care of you. Though it is imaginary, you can see how in this case there is a divergence between the previous literal definition of the language being used and the idea that I was actually trying to capture, for which I merely used father as a shorthand or an approximation for a lack of better, more specific term. When I encountered an exception that called for it, I effectively redirected or rerouted that word from one meaning to the other by establishing my intention to the listener. I say it typically means one thing, yes, but in this context, for you, take it to mean something else. A linguistic detour. We then develop language for this distinction to be used whenever necessary. In this case, it would be adoptive father versus biological father. There are some circumstances where you do need to specify one or the other, but there's also many cases where the distinction is unimportant, so I can just use the unqualified unifying term father. This works out especially well in the father example because in many cases the distinction isn't even apparent, meaning you can't tell by looking. You've probably encountered people in your life whose father was not their biological progenitor and you didn't even notice. In many cases, the children themselves don't even notice. This isn't necessary for a linguistic rerouting, but it does help the transition happen more smoothly. So now we come back and ask the question, why choose a less rigid definition of father? What's the point? What's the advantage? Why do it? And in a sense, the answer is that we didn't even choose it. It just happened, as the result of a divergence between the intended meaning that we're trying to focus on and the formal definition of the word that had existed before. As for what advantages conferred, I guess it would be ease, convenience, simplicity. Instead of calling your adoptive father a father too, I could have made the clarification every single time. Ask your father, or if you don't have a father, then ask any male who is raising you like a father, even if he technically isn't, to help you with this. But it's so much easier to just establish that for our purposes here, that person counts as a father because he's doing the important father stuff, so when I say father, you can take this guy to be included. We could say that this person is an honorary father. In a similar sense, we could say that trans women are honorary women, because this whole analysis and rationale seems no less applicable to the concept of manhood and womanhood. Consider what I said earlier. The trans agenda is just a person making a proposal to their community to be treated like the sex that they're not. And regardless of your personal attitude toward that request, the reality is that in many communities, that proposal has been broadly accepted. There are, in fact, biological males who are thought of, spoken of, and generally treated like females, even by people who realize they technically aren't. The exact criteria by which this happens does vary, but suffice to say that if a male were to express a persistent psychological desire to live as a woman and make significant change to their hair, clothing, behavior, and body all to become more female-like, then society at large, at least where I live and probably where you live, is going to accept this person as a woman and let them do woman things and talk about them as a woman, kind of like an adoptive parent being accepted as a parent. Also, much like the distinction between adoptive versus biological father, we established the distinction between trans women and cis women because there are situations in which you do care about that difference, but then when you don't care about the difference, you can just say women. Trans women didn't need to be considered women. It isn't of some grand importance. Woman is just a word, after all. I could imagine an alternate timeline where the linguistic shift I'm talking about never happened, where trans activists never said trans women are women, and instead everybody in society did stick with a strict, unchanging definition for the term, adult human female. In that world, what would be the fate of trans women? Well, a person might ask me, are trans women women? And in that timeline, I guess I would say no, but then I might say, we should treat them like women though, even though they technically aren't, and really, what difference would that make? Aside from the words we use to describe it, not much. Remember, it's ultimately how we treat people that is actually important. We tend to care about language only because language often affects people's perception, which affects how people act and how people treat one another. But if in theory those things weren't connected, and we did treat trans women just like other women, even though when asked we said technically they're not, well then whatever. But why did that not happen? Why do we live in the trans women are women timeline instead of that one? Because it would be weird. This timeline is the one with the more natural, intuitive evolution of language. If I'm at a restaurant with a trans woman and I say to somebody, oh yeah, I'm at the table with that man over there, pointing at somebody who looks like a female to everybody else, they're going to be confused. They're going to be like, what? Who? And nobody wants trans men who look like males in the female washroom. Nobody wants to have to rewrite all of our laws and policies. Nobody wants to bother updating the way that they phrase everything in order to integrate these exceptions more explicitly. It makes more sense to just integrate the exceptions into the language by shrugging and just saying, trans women count as women and trans men count as men. It really is just the simpler, more common sense solution to the whole dilemma. Why did trans people become such a popular topic in the 2010s? To many people, this seemed like a random cultural shift that kinda came out of nowhere. Like if society just got bored of its previous struggles and went out looking for some shiny new cultural thing to divide us over. The shift was actually a consequence of systemic and institutional changes that a lot of people were not paying attention to at the time, some of which simply resulted from research and understanding of trans people reaching a critical mass, where the opinion of establishment medical professionals was changing in response to accumulating evidence and an increasing volume of advocacy. In 2011, a major professional organization dedicated to research and treatment of trans people, known as the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, or HBIGDA, was renamed the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. In the following year, it published version 7 of its Standards of Care for the Health of Transgender and Gender Diverse People, often shortened to simply the Standards of Care, or the SOC. This was a major change from the previous version of the Standards of Care published in 2001. It finally discontinued the Benjamin scale for diagnosing gender identity disorder. Although progressive for its time, having been developed by the very well-meaning Harry Benjamin as part of his 1966 book The Transsexual Phenomenon, the Benjamin scale had become inconsistent with a modern understanding of gender identity. It also set much higher requirements for diagnosis than we have today because, well, this was a newer phenomenon at the time, so they were being cautious and trying to reduce liability for practitioners. The language and framing about transsexual, transgender, or gender diverse people was also updated, stressing that such people are not necessarily disordered. Overall, this change contributed to destigmatization, it led to transitioning being far more accessible for normal trans people, and it became a great resource for future advocacy and policymaking. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, issued their 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, often called the DSM. This update not only replaced gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria, but reframed how we even think about these things from the identity itself being the disorder and a problem, to instead our goal being to address the anxiety or distress that such people experience, and that being the problem. Like the WPATH changes, this contributed to destigmatization and helped increase accessibility of care. The emergence of social media was also a noteworthy factor in increasing awareness of numerous social issues, including transgender identity, as it enabled emergent dialogue that might have not taken place otherwise at all, or at least not nearly to the same extent. In 2005, nobody had a smartphone. There was no such thing as Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok. 7 years later, in 2012, all of those websites had become mainstream, well, except for TikTok, which took another 8 years or so. There are still people who don't fully recognize how much of a change this was for our culture, because of how it enabled people all throughout society to share information, to connect, and to engage in conversation about anything they wanted, and often in a semi-anonymous manner. This was huge for minority voices, or for voices that would have been marginalized in the previous decades and had difficulty breaking through the more centralized landscape of legacy media. The amount of discourse that took place focusing on race, gender, and sexuality suddenly exploded because normal people started talking about it in a way that they weren't able to before. It was a decade of freedom and self-expression that people who grew up before this time rarely had access to. Then, in and around 2015, there were some major breakthroughs in mainstream cultural representation. This was the year that Caitlyn Jenner came out as transgender, the most high-profile person ever to do so. It shocked the world, and it sparked God knows how many conversations in how many households across America. Normal people who had never heard of a transgender before suddenly became very much aware. It was also in 2015 that I Am Jazz, a reality television show spotlighting transgender teenager Jazz Jennings, debuted on TLC with mainstream support, funding, and attention. This girl literally looks at the camera and says she has a penis. They were not playing around. There's no way for it to go over your head. There's something very empowering about discovering or developing the language and concepts with which to make sense of the world around you. The random lines become a pattern, the noise becomes music, the mess becomes a system that you can predict and navigate. I remember when I was very young, the first time that I read about gender dysphoria or trans people. It's a really eye-opening experience to connect that with what you've been feeling and experiencing for so long. If those resources don't exist and these conversations never happen, then yeah, there will be some people who have the internal quality of being trans who just never quite put it together. So if society goes in the other direction and openly addresses these things while also being accepting of the people who come out, it's going to seem like the number of trans people goes up. Not because more are being created, but because more are becoming self-aware and choosing to be open about it. Okay, so some final questions and thoughts. How many genders are there? This was a question that got a lot of attention 10 years ago, and which led to people defiantly claiming there's only 2 genders, in opposition to all those who would entertain any other answer. Traditionally, gender was an abstraction based on observations about sex, which led most cultures to developing a simple binary understanding of masculinity and femininity, which is enduringly intuitive for us today. However, there is no strict rule that prevents us from just imagining other categories if doing so feels useful. Most obviously, we could demarcate the space in between the two ends of a spectrum as its own category, like looking at a spectrum from red to blue and calling the middle part purple. So the proposal is that we carve out a middle category when it comes to masculinity and femininity, and we call this middle section non-binary. This is just the name that everybody has settled on for it. The argument in favor of doing so is that our society has use cases for such a concept, very androgynous people who identify and present as something in between being very masculine or very feminine. However, it seems like most discourse about this ends up being about the plausibility of creating such a category in theory than whether there's actually a social need for it. I think there are numerous things to consider. First, if it's not intuitive, or if it doesn't click for most people, then it may simply never catch on or become socially meaningful, and there's a good chance this is the case for a third gender. After all, dealing with only the concepts of masculine and feminine as a one-dimensional spectrum where the vast majority of people, something greater than 99%, are clearly and obviously one or the other, is the paradigm that we have been existing in for hundreds of years. Our language and culture have developed around this being the case. And in our gender-based social order, the idea of somebody being a gender other than man or woman immediately raises some weird questions that we have to think about, like, if this person were to have sex with a man, is it gay or straight? And if this person wants to use a gendered facility like a washroom, do they use the men's or women's? I guess they could just use whichever one they want, but are we okay with that? Like, what if they switched every other day? I also think there's a difference in terms of social reality faced by the people in question. I think that trans women and trans men do in fact succeed at being perceived, thought of, and treated as the sex they identify with. But people who self-identify as something other than man and woman, I think are still generally just interpreted as either men or women by other people in society, depending on whether they look more male or more female. In other words, they kind of just loop back around and become non-binary males or non-binary females. It kinda just feels like a different way of saying tomboy and femboy. Isn't it kinda weird that both of these terms ended up having boy at the end? Anyway, this is how I imagine that people would base their answers to my previous questions. A man who has sex with a non-binary person would feel like he's having gay sex if the non-binary person in question was a non-binary male who looked like a man, while if the non-binary person looked more female, then he would probably feel like he's having straight sex. And I imagine/hope that most non-binary people are just using the washrooms of whatever their sex is. Unless the non-binary person we're talking about is also a transsexual, in which case I guess it flips around. The point is that even though non-binary people identify as something other than man or woman, I feel like most people in society don't really have a third category in their brain when they look at you, so really you just end up being put in either the male or female box. Transsexuals are able to move from one box to the other, but non-binary people are not, in practice, able to get people to think of them as something other than one of the two boxes. And I'm not saying this should be the case, or that there's something, inherently wrong with wanting a third category. I'm just observing that in practice, I don't think that's what happens. Unless you're somebody like Addison Rose Vincent, who has, an extremely mixed appearance, they might shock the average person enough that people's minds create a third category to put them in. But I don't think you could say the same about most other non-binary people, so I don't know. There are also some non-binary people who claim they are not between masculine and feminine, but off the spectrum entirely. Well, what does that mean? For most people, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's incoherent. It's like a person saying, I'm not tall or short, nor am I anything in between. I don't have a height. Or maybe, I'm not hot or cold, nor am I anything in between. I don't have a temperature. The most that I've been able to make sense of this is, I think some people have an inner sense of thinking about themselves as a masculine person, and therefore trying to do masculine things. They want to walk in a masculine way, talk in a masculine way, they want to do things that people consider masculine, and they want to avoid doing anything feminine, and then vice versa for people who consider themselves feminine. Well, imagine if a person said that rather than holding one of these two attitudes, they feel no connection or aversion to either side. They just do whatever they want without any consideration for the gendered associations of their choices or behavior. That person might describe themselves as not having a gender identity because they don't identify with one or the other. The way that I try to relate to this is by thinking about possible distinctions between two categories where other people might have a preference but I don't care at all. Like, if you were to ask me, do I prefer music from England or from America? I don't know. I don't really think about it. I guess some bands I like are English, some are American. Maybe if I were to sit here and, like, list it all out, I would find that I have a lean one way or the other. But the point is, I don't even think about it like that. It's not even in my head. There could also be a different way of approaching this, where a person feels some kind of anxiety about being put in a box, made to feel like they have to choose between and commit to being one and only one of two possible categories. And that could be how a person like this relates to the feeling of dysphoria, if that's what they claim. Now, what are the social consequences of this? I don't know. Possibly nothing. It's like asking what the social consequences are of a person who claims to be aromantic, meaning they have no romantic feelings at all. What does that mean to you? Do you care? I guess if you're trying to date them you might, but otherwise if they're just some random person, then yeah, no, you have no reason to care. But you do get to learn a little bit more about how this other human's mind works. When you live in a society where people have a lot of freedom to express what they want, some people will end up expressing uncommon feelings, and then sometimes will come up with language to describe those feelings, even if the act of feeling them isn't particularly consequential for other people in our lives. Perhaps confusingly, there are even some categories of personal identity that don't seem to entail or require any particular external performance or change, and are therefore not even visible to an outside observer. A person who claims to be non-binary or agender or some other gender-divergent identity might just look like a normal man or woman to you. The only difference, the only thing that makes them what they claim to be, is their self-reported internal feelings. Finally, I'll just graph out some of these overlapping categories. Intersex people are not necessarily trans. I may have made it sound like they were earlier. There are some intersex males who are also trans women, but there are some intersex males who remain men, and similar for intersex females. Non-binary and other gender non-conforming people might also identify as transsexuals if they transition. There are some people who refer to themselves as non-binary trans or trans non-binary, meaning they transitioned, but after they transitioned they consider themselves non-binary still rather than identifying with the opposite sex. And you can have an intersex person who physically transitions but then identifies as non-binary despite having the phenotypical traits of the opposite sex. So these three categories all have some overlap, while also being distinct enough ideas that people could be one without being the other two, or be two of them without being the third, or potentially even be all three.